right, for our next speaker, we have Andy Whitman. Andy has worked for over 25 years at Manomet with forest landowners to support continual improvement of forest management and forest sustainability. This has included helping lead the Climate Smart Forestry Network and peer learning network of over 15 landowners across North America. For the last 15 years, he's worked on sustainability and climate change issues in forestry and agriculture. He has an MS of Wildlife Ecology from Maine. So please help me welcome Andy Whitman.
Thank you for coming out. It's not always I get a chance to talk in front of not just the regular folks, but bosses past and present. Always a delight. So just to be clear, the presentation I'm giving today is based on some work I did at Manomet. For some of you may know, I've worked at Manomet for a long time up until November last year and have moved over to the Maine Forest Service. So comments, answers to Q&A, all of those you can think of as that's Andy the Manomet guy and not Andy Whitman, the Maine Forest Service person. So thank you for being here with me. This presentation or this project is a result of work that was conducted by Eric Walsh and myself. And Eric actually has also moved on to another position, actually the U.S. Forest Service, working on forest carbon in the West. So I'm going to talk about the Climate Smart Forestry Manual that was for the Northeast. Just briefly, Manomet, for some of you may know, is an organization, environmental organization that's been around for more than 50 years and uses partnerships to help nature and local communities thrive. And this is the result of work done in one of its programs called the Climate Smart Land Network, which has been around for about 10 years, has included 18 different large commercial landowners, operate in 27 states, 6 provinces, who collectively manage over 30 million acres. And that program is really focused on climate smart forestry, which includes resilience or adaptation, the mitigation piece, but also intensification, recognizing the need to create not just more wood fiber from our land, but other ecosystem services in the face of climate change. And it was a project with the Maine Tree Foundation, which is based in Augusta, Maine. And their mission is to educate and advocate for the sustainable use of forests and the ecological, economic, and social components. So I'm going to talk just briefly about what prompted this work. What are some of the drivers of forest climate action, the why behind this work. So part of this is just in the background of all this, what's going on is there's these pressures on companies and on their products with regard to sustainability in general, but also specific to climate. So for forest companies, they have to deal with climate disclosure pressures. Some of those are regulatory, so some of you may be aware of what's been going on with the SEC and climate change disclosure there. California has its own emerging disclosure requirements for companies. EU has the same thing going on, in the United Kingdom as well. And then a lot of companies are enrolled in different kinds of voluntary ESG reporting programs that also deal with climate. A lot of it is more focused on carbon, but a number of these efforts are also focusing on climate risk and what that poses to businesses. Then there's also a focus on forest products, primarily greenhouse gas disclosure. So there's the risk or threat of carbon tariffs from other countries like the EU area. Retailers for a long time, for over a decade, have been putting pressure on manufacturers on the greenhouse gas emissions from their products. And then also retailers have been more and more interested in environmental product declarations and other kinds of ways of certifying or qualifying the greenhouse gas footprint of products. At the same time, I'm sure everybody's aware of what's been going on with voluntary carbon markets, and those have been slowly increasing, and some are actually projecting those are going to take off. I'm sort of on the sidelines wondering, thinking we'll just have to wait and see, but nonetheless, a lot of interest in forests from that perspective. And then finally, there's been a lot of work going on in the forest certification arena. So under SFI, they underwent a recent revision, which added 2 objectives related to climate. The most important one is Objective 9, that focuses on climate-smart forestry, adaptation, and mitigation, but also Objective 10, which in some fire resilience and awareness, which in some reasons also is a climate issue. And FSC, though it's in revision, it's also draft standards have indicated there's going to be some significant changes in terms of requirements on climate change. In the state I work in, half the acres are in forest certification, which means half of those acres, one way or another, are going to end up being managed for climate change simply because of the requirements of forest certification. So you've heard a lot already from Allie. Thank you for that great introduction, Allie, in terms of the challenges we face with respect to climate change. In response to that, a lot of landowners, forest managers, seeking ways to, through their forest management, address those concerns. They've got the new SFI standard to deal with. There's also, a recognition of, well, everybody could go their own way, or we could try and work together and have some frameworks, a handbook, if you would have, that helps generate some consistency, but also avoid everybody having to duplicate, learning the same lessons, trying to find the same material, and addressing both climate change and certification requirements. So this project actually was initiated by Maine Tree Foundation, and we came in soon after they started this project to help out with this project and do a lot of the legwork. And it was developed as a pilot for the Northeast United States to include those northeastern states, but also the Canadian Maritime provinces of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. The approach we took in terms of climate-smart forestry is complicated. Usually we think of either the adaptation piece and the mitigation piece is sort of illustrated up here. But in the end, we're also trying to manage our forests to generate these ecosystem benefits. For this crowd, an important part of that is wood fiber, but I think most landowners acknowledge there's these other benefits as well. And as foresters, they're all interconnected. This is really, it's complicated. You find elegant solutions to address this complexity, but it all can make us scratch our heads in terms of how do we integrate these things to achieve different landowner objectives. The purpose of the manual was sort of to embrace this model of climate-smart forestry. And I would, again, reframe it, as I said in the beginning, of there's the adaptation or resilience piece, there's the mitigation piece, and the intensification piece. And usually when we say intensification, we think, oh, you're talking about plantation forestry. Which is part of intensification, but I think of more broadly intensification is how do we be more focused on every acre of land that we manage. And you can appreciate in that context, if you're a forester who marks wood, that careful marking of wood is also a form of intensification. It's about careful consideration at that sub-stand level about what's the best treatment to achieve your objectives for that stand. And so the purpose of this manual is sort of to introduce a land management approach for companies for climate-smart forestry and to help managers connect their current practices with climate-smart forestry. A lot of times we think forward about what we might do for the future and we forget what are we doing today that may be actually already helping us with that, or what are we doing today that we might tweak just a little bit, just a tiny bit, that actually will help us, our actions and our impacts on the ground better prepare our organizations and our forests for the future. So the project approach was basically recognizing under certification, there's two audiences actually we need to consider. There's the certification managers. They have to help organize their company around certification requirements, including climate change. And so they work what I would call more at the policy level within their companies and set up different frameworks and actions and analytical processes to support certification. And they have a slightly different problem from the forest managers who are actually managing the forest asset on the ground, which is traditionally what we talk about when we talk about climate change and forestry. And then in this process, we acknowledge that there's sort of these risks. There's opportunities. If you have a risk, you always have an opportunity in business. And then practices and actions to respond to those risks and opportunities that are posed by climate change. And brought that into a survey of users. So we had a survey of certification managers and a survey of forest managers. I'm not going to get into a lot of the results today because it's a lot of data. But I'll give you some teasers on that. And so that information was used to really to underpin the Climate Smart Forestry Manual and create a handbook that sort of was the overarching framework for all of this. So, sorry for the fine print. It's even fine enough, so I'm going to have to talk you through some of this. But this will give you an idea of sort of what are some of the kinds of things we're finding out from the survey. So, this is a very information-rich graph, so I'm sorry for that. But on basically along the left margin, what you can see is the likelihood that a survey recipient would recommend a practice. And these round circles represent means. And then the color, and the intensity of the color indicates just how well that practice is expected to perform to achieve a particular outcome. No, I'm sorry, I got one thing mixed up. So the size of the circle indicates the likelihood of recommendation. The left-hand margin indicates the likelihood that it's going to meet that objective. So in this first graph, which is our first box in the upper left, you can see it's some in the front can see it refers to sort of the diversity of forest species and structure, manage the diversity of forest species and structure to increase resiliency. And you can see the circle is sort of a moderate size, so it's somewhat recommended by the survey recipients to use this. It's likely that they will use this, which indicates sort of not all the time, but it's a definite consideration. And its effectiveness is considered to be fairly good, very good. At the far end of this graphic, you can see on the top row, for lack of better words, there's a recommendation or a practice of using plant genotypes with broad moisture temperature tolerance and plant them in partial harvests. And you can see, okay, the circle's small, so not likely, not recommended. The likelihood of effectiveness is considered not to be, it's unlikely, it's not likely. Recipient said it's not likely to be very effective, and the color is very faded, indicating that it rates fairly poor. And so it's using this kind of information to have an idea of how much are these used in current practice and how much are they recommended. For practices that really score low, those are not practices, how do I put it? We would report those practices, but we would make it clear that those were low, had low rankings. And that why users of the handbook, when we have these recommendations both for certification managers and for foresters, could have an understanding of what are their peers doing? And would their peers recommend these? Are these impactful? Are they useful practices? So in terms of, so one of the generalized outcomes, just to help you appreciate the results of this survey, if you look at how many recommendations were substantially used, none of the things we recommended were substantially used. They weren't used in every stand, every kind of situation in the field. Not surprising. But what was interesting was, from a climate change perspective, the top concern and practices that rated really highly were those that aimed at managing invasive plant species. Others included using that included things like using native seed mixes, conservation mixes to control erosion, Other practices that were highly rated were, not surprising, sizing replacement culverts and improving drainage, something that's already in place widely. Diversifying stand composition, using thinning to reduce the risk of stress, improving growth, and then also diversifying species and stand structure. So for forest managers, 5 of the 32 practices that were surveyed had no application. They're extremely low rated. So that, 2 examples, one of which I've already mentioned, about planting in partial harvests, planting species that are well adapted to future conditions. There are also a number of practices related to the idea of using prescribed fire. Again, kind of a no-brainer for this area. Not necessarily for other areas, but for the Northeast, that these practices were not highly rated. So just some other things in terms of, approaching this idea of climate-smart forestry. I mean, this is, I think, a familiar concept to most people in the room in terms of how we can think about managing forest for resistance, resilience, and transition. And on one end, with resistance, what we're trying to do is actually stay in the same place. When you move over to transition, we're thinking about how do we manage that stand so that it can change and keep up with what's going on with climate change. And so that, is a key part of sort of parts of the handbook and its underpinnings and thinking on the land management or the stand management level. But on the certification level, there's a sort of a parallel track to think of. Again, similar to this notion of resistance, resilience, and transition, just as we have to think about that potentially for stands, businesses also need to think about that. Only in the short term, most companies in their vis-a-vis certification, do not radically change things, but, figure out how to, maybe change things up a little bit, but stay pretty much the same. But over time, as you look farther and farther in the future, then you have to have consideration for these other options of, do you, need to take a more resilient approach or even a transformational approach? And that's not out of the, sort of the realm of what companies do today. Markets change, and so technology changes, and just between those 2 elements, then companies sometimes do move quickly into these other, stages of change and potentially transformation. And so not only do we think of that and apply that in terms of the handbook on the sort of the stand management or forest management approach, but also in terms of the certification manager approach and how they integrate, how they approach to climate-smart forestry at that sort of higher level, organizational level. So, basically the handbook has sort of this forest management section. It has this certification and sustainability framework section that really combine to approach this problem of climate-smart forestry. The forest management section has 2 sections. I'll talk a little bit more about that. The certification portion really has 1 section focused on 17 objectives of sustainable forestry. And really, it's not just at the stand level we need to think about things, and we need to sort of bump that up to the organizational level and how an organization approaches this problem. Fortunately, coming after me, Andy Colness will speak, and she can really talk about how do you think about climate-smart forestry writ 1 step larger in terms of the economy. So again, there's these 4 sections. There's an introduction. There's a section that describes sort of how to approach forest certification with 17 key forest sustainability topics. Some might be wondering, like, is this useful for somebody who's FSC certified? And I would say it is, because though SFI is organized in one particular fashion, those topics I think are germane to all forest certification systems. Then there's section 3 that describes various risks based on results from the Forest Manager Survey and literature. And then finally, section 4 is basically a manual aimed at forest managers. So briefly, this is introduction. The introduction part just talks about generally climate-smart approaches and how to bring stand and landscape level management together. And section 2 gets into more detail, really aimed at forest certification managers. And it includes practical information about different kinds of climate-smart management actions. It talks about these topics. It's not so much focused on these topics as much as these topics and how they intersect with climate change. And finally, it really focuses on identifying what are the risks within those topics, what are some practical actions and other actions. Practical actions being those that are highly rated by users. Other actions are those that were not highly rated, and I'll come from the scientific literature, and also provides resources so that the user can figure out, like, okay, on a technical level, what do I need for resources to take the next step to address how climate change affects this topic. And just as a reminder for those of you who aren't current on NSFI, here's the 17 objectives. And it's just, I put this slide up just to highlight that, objectives 9, of course, are really important with respect to climate change, but climate change intersects with all this stuff. And it is messy that way. And what's really messy is to figure out, okay, there's the non-climate change aspect of these topics, the ongoing running stuff. And then there's objective 9, and then there's the messy stuff in the middle where it's like, okay, hold on, is climate change more the big issue with respect to training and education, or is this just regular challenges with training and education? And that's kind of the complexity and messiness. The handbook really focuses on the climate change portion of that. So some of these topics it doesn't have much information on at all, because there's not a strong intersection. It's mostly the same old challenges with or without climate change. Section 3, its audience is aimed at forest managers. Again, it takes the information from the survey combined with information from the literature. The risks that emerged from the survey were pests and pathogens, drought, and extreme weather, so that's the focus of that portion of the handbook. And then section 4 really, again, is aimed at the managers, and it describes those key risks and then some of the practical climate-smart management practices that respond to that, and really trying to bridge what we find out from the literature, but with what's actually going on the ground. So, just a reminder, this work was really possible with the Maine Tree Foundation and interacting a lot with the SICs, principally the Maine SIC, but SICs in every state, and the feedback that they provided. And then also feedback from UMaine staff and some other people in some early drafts. So I want to thank all of them because it was really all of that input, all of that direction that made this possible. I have had questions about, is this available? And we're standing by for SFI to post it. And with that, I'll stop and take questions.
Thank you, Andy. So we do have about 5 minutes for questions. So who has something? Yes, sir.
Thanks. Hi. Best use case woodlots in Maine that you would suggest visiting for good climate smart forestry in practice?
I don't have a good answer. I can't answer you like if I wanted to go on a tour to see the best stuff. Okay, I would probably start. Sorry, Bob, but and Jessica, but I would probably go to Bob and Jessica's woodlot, not because they have perfectly figured it out, but because they're thinking hard about that. If you want to, perfect conditions, you don't really learn a lot. You walk in and you just say to yourself, "Crap, I can't do this." Or this is really hard, or this is really expensive, or most of the landowners I work with, not happening. And in a conversation with folks like Jessica and Bob, that's like, we can get to the realities of like, yeah, you could do this, but not many landowners would do that. This might work. So that's a place I would start. I would, on the carbon end, I would look for some of the nonprofits that are enrolled in carbon offset projects. And again, it's not so much that they have it perfect, but they've had to do a lot of the heavy thinking so they can help you figure out like, oh, okay, these are the 5 things I need to think about that I didn't realize I needed to know when managing for carbon.
Any other questions? We have time for a couple more.
Oh, and I would add Weyerhaeuser has a carbon project, and so I might add them to the bunch because they've had to think it through. I'm not, and none of these, nobody's perfect here. It's just you're going to come away with, you're going to answer a bunch of questions, and then like always happens is now you're going to have twice as many questions. But it's a start.
Andy, there was one little detail in your slideshow that brought up a question of mine. When we think of climate smart forestry, it's a pretty broad umbrella. And what we've been talking about in the last 2 is sort of how do we make forests more resilient or resistant or adapt to climate change, species risks and things like that. But then there's the other question of how do we make forests, how do we maximize their potential as natural climate solutions, which has to do mainly with carbon sequestration. And one of the practices that was shown in your survey there was reduce rotations to minimize climate risk. I assume the climate will change less over the life of a 40-year tree than the life of a 150-year tree. But for carbon sequestration, most of the recommendations are increased rotations. And for those 2 aspects, it seems like usually the recommendations are aligned with each other and similar species diversity and things like that. But that seemed to be a place where maybe the sort of adaptation question was in conflict with the carbon sequestration goal. And I wonder if you run across other issues where they're sort of managing for one may be counterproductive for the other. I noticed that recommendation didn't get a very high rating. So.
Right, yeah, so I preface my thinking with sort of the hypothesis that's sort of posed by the Focal report that was referenced this morning. This notion of, well, first of all, when we think about managing for carbon, it's not a stand level thing that we need to manage for, it's a landscape level thing. That is, we know that if we're going to sock away a bunch of carbon reserves, then we need to make up for that lost wood production somewhere else. And the Focal report, illustrates a way that's conceivable. That is, to your point earlier this morning of we may need to rely on some intensive silviculture to achieve those goals. Now, so there's 2 elements of this. There's the large scale, which is how do we manage those different trade-offs at the landscape scale. But then even at the stand level, I think of at one extreme you have reserves or ecological forestry. You get a lot of carbon on the ground, not as much wood production, and you're focused on your carbon in the forest. And I would say for intensive silviculture, you don't get as much carbon on the ground, but you potentially get it in your products. And so you need to focus on that. Now, it aligns very well with what we do now, because people who do plantation forestry are very focused on utilization and pushing things into products. And so it's not like, oh, we need to think that differently or do something really new and different, but it helps us understand there's more value. There's a financial value to that, but there's also actually a carbon value to that. Can we get everything on every acre? We can't. We never have. We've always had to figure that out. But the carbon thing painfully means we have to think about landscapes, and we're not well equipped to do that. I'm not a big regulation guy and many other things, so I'm not suggesting anything like that. But if you really want it all, then we have to think about how to support that at larger scales.
Unfortunately, we have to move on to the next speaker. Thank you, Andy, again. Appreciate it.